Imagine the sound just stops. Not all at once, maybe. For some it was an illness, a fever, an injury to the head. For others, it was simply how they were born, a silence they'd never known any different from. Either way, picture standing in a room full of people, talking, laughing, calling your name, and hearing none of it. Just movement, just mouths opening and closing, hands gesturing, faces reacting to something you can't access at all. Now imagine that world has no written language most people can read, no telephones, no captions, no way to explain to anyone what's actually happening inside your head. All you have is what people decide to believe about you. For most of human history, that belief was devastating. And it didn't come from cruelty alone. It came from one of the most respected thinkers who ever lived. Let's start with what deafness actually is, because ancient people had almost no framework for it at all. Hearing loss could come from birth, from illness, from an injury, from age, completely different causes producing the same result. But without any understanding of how sound reached the brain in the first place, ancient observers couldn't separate cannot hear from cannot think. And that confusion would end up shaping the lives of deaf people for thousands of years. In ancient Greece, the philosopher Aristotle wrote something that would echo far longer than almost any single medical claim in history. He argued that because deaf people couldn't hear spoken language, they were incapable of being taught to reason at all, that speech itself was the thing that made rational thought possible, and without it, deaf individuals were, in his framing, closer to animals than to full human beings. This wasn't a fringe opinion. Aristotle was one of the most influential thinkers in the ancient world, and his writing on this specific point would be cited, repeated, and treated as settled fact for close to 2,000 years. Deaf people were routinely denied education, denied legal rights, denied the ability to inherit property in some societies, not because anyone had tested whether they could learn, but because one enormously respected voice had declared, centuries earlier, that they couldn't. And yet, even in Aristotle's own era, there's a strange crack in that certainty. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates is recorded musing aloud that if humans had no voice at all, they would naturally communicate by hands, head, and other parts of the body, the same way, he says, the deaf already do. It's a passing comment, almost an aside, but it means that even in ancient Athens, someone had clearly watched deaf people communicating fluently with their hands, and understood exactly what he was seeing. The evidence that language didn't require sound was sitting right there. Almost nobody built on it. In ancient Jewish law, deafness carried a specific legal category. A person who was both deaf and unable to speak was classified alongside minors and those considered of unsound mind, exempted from certain religious and legal obligations, but also, as a consequence, stripped of certain rights and responsibilities that came with full adult status in the community. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a legal system trying to account for someone it didn't know how to categorize any other way. Roman law drew its own strange distinction, one that reveals just how tangled this assumption really was. Under later Roman legal tradition, a person who had been born hearing and lost their hearing later in life was generally still permitted to write a will and manage property because they had, at some point, demonstrably learned language the normal way. But someone born deaf was frequently denied that same legal capacity outright, regardless of how clearly they could actually communicate or reason. The law wasn't really tracking ability at all. It was tracking whether a person had once had access to spoken language, as if the capacity for thought itself had to enter through the ears first. Elsewhere, belief about deafness took a very different shape. In a number of cultures across the ancient world, deaf and mute individuals were viewed not as diminished, but as touched by something beyond ordinary perception, set apart from the usual noise of the world in a way that was treated as spiritually significant rather than purely medical. It didn't erase the isolation, but it meant that in some communities, a deaf person's silence was read as closeness to something sacred, not distance from something normal. Traditional Chinese medicine took yet another approach entirely, one that, like its explanation for seizures, looked for a physical rather than supernatural cause. In this framework, hearing was understood to be governed by the health of the kidneys, and hearing loss was treated as a sign of internal imbalance rather than possession or punishment. It wasn't a correct explanation by modern medical standards, but it was, notably, not a story about demons or curses. It was an attempt, however flawed, to locate the cause inside the body rather than outside it. So, what did an ordinary deaf person actually do, day to day, in a world with no formal way to teach them? Mostly, they built their own systems. Within families, especially where deafness ran through generations, simple home signs would emerge naturally. Gestures for food, danger, family members, daily tasks. Invented out of necessity, refined through repetition, understood perfectly within a household, even if nobody outside it could follow along. Wherever a community had more than one deaf person living close together, some version of shared gestural communication tended to appear on its own, without anyone designing it. Humans, it turns out, will always find a way to build language, whether or not sound is involved. But that home-built fluency almost never extended past the front door. Step outside that household, and a deaf person was often assumed, because of Aristotle, because of legal categories, because of simple unfamiliarity, to have nothing meaningful to say at all. Wealth changed the equation somewhat. A deaf child born into a powerful or wealthy family might be kept close, protected, even taught privately by someone patient enough to try. A deaf child born into poverty had almost no such chance. The condition itself hadn't changed. Only the resources around it had. There's one striking exception worth knowing, even though it comes centuries later than the ancient world we've been discussing. In the Ottoman court, deaf attendants weren't just tolerated, they became genuinely valued members of the palace, trusted specifically because they couldn't repeat sensitive spoken conversations. Over time, a fully functioning sign language developed inside that court, used so fluently that hearing officials, and even sultans, learned it themselves, sometimes specifically to hold conversations no one nearby could overhear. It stands as rare, striking proof of something the rest of the ancient and medieval world took millennia to accept. Given the chance, deaf communication could be every bit as rich, fast, and useful as spoken language, sometimes even more useful, depending on who you didn't want listening. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The shift away from Aristotle's claim took an extraordinarily long time almost everywhere else. It wasn't a handful of generations. It was close to 2,000 years before formal, sustained deaf education began to take shape in the wider world. The first well-documented efforts emerging in the 1500s and expanding significantly in the 1700s, when educators began systematically teaching deaf students to read, write, and communicate through structured sign language, finally demonstrating in practice what Socrates had noticed in passing and what an Ottoman court had already quietly proven centuries before anyone else took it seriously. 2,000 years is an almost unbelievable gap between someone clearly saw the truth and the world acted on it. And the reason wasn't a lack of evidence. Deaf people had been communicating fluently, thinking clearly, and living full inner lives that entire time. The barrier wasn't ability, it was the assumption nobody bothered to question, repeated so many times by so many respected voices that it hardened into something people mistook for fact. That's really the uncomfortable center of this story. It's not really about hearing at all. It's about what happens when one confident, authoritative claim goes unchallenged for so long that an entire category of human beings gets written out of full participation in their own society, not because anyone proved they belonged there, but because nobody with enough standing bothered to ask. Today, sign languages are recognized by linguists as complete, fully expressive languages in their own right, every bit as capable of conveying philosophy, humor, poetry, and abstract reasoning as any spoken language ever was. The thing Aristotle insisted was impossible was, this entire time, simply a different channel for something humans have always been able to do. So picture that room again, the one full of people talking, where you can't hear a single word. Somewhere in that room, for thousands of years, there was always a fully formed mind, a complete inner world, a person with every bit as much to say as everyone speaking around them. The silence was never the problem. The world just took far too long to stop assuming it was. If you want more of the history nobody actually teaches you, subscribe, because next week's video is about something that could kill you instantly, and did, thousands of times, before anyone understood why.